Welcome to the Coding Loft. My name is Samuel and today you will learn how to build a really cool counter in JavaScript. So when you reload a page, you can select an element and it starts to count up to a predefined number. And as you can see, you can change the steps and the speed of each counter. So let's jump right in. And if you like today's content, I would be very thankful if you leave a like and maybe even subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this in the future. Now about the setup, as you can see, we have a main container called achievements. Inside we have a container that basically specifies a max width. Inside of this container we have a row, and inside the row we have 3 columns, which are these achievement cards that you see right here. So we have 3 of these cards, and inside each card we have a material icon on top. We have a number right here and then a text below that. So in our case, it's this achievements card number class that we want to select in order to change the number via JavaScript. For the styles, there's a basic CSS reset at the beginning from DigitalOcean. I will link it down in the description. And then we have the main styles where we basically center everything in the middle. And as I said, the container is there to specify a max width, and the row inside is used to have different columns. And as you can see, each column in our case has a width of 31%. So each of these cards has the same width. We give this achievements container a light gray background, and each achievement card has a white background, some padding, some margin, and we align all the items using flags. So that means that the icon and the number and the countries are aligned in a column and they're aligned to the center. Then we just define some font size for the number, for the text, and for the icon. That's our setup for this project. Of course, in your setup you might have a completely different layout of the page. The important thing is that you have a reference to this number that you want to change, and in our case it's this achievements card number class. Now, inside of our JavaScript, we will start by defining a class and we call it counter because it counts from 0 to a certain number. And first we have a constructor function where we define some properties. And we will have a config object to initialize each counter, and you will see how that looks in a second. Now each counter that we initialize has 2 main functions. So one is to get the element that we want, so the number element that we want to change, and then we want to start our counter. Last but not least, we need an init function, and in here we say that, well, whenever we call this init function, we say this.getElement. We want to get our element first, and once we have that element, we want to start our counter. And we call our init function right here in the constructor. So that means each time we initialize a new counter object, we will call this.init function. And we can see that simply by console.logging down here init. Now let's start with this first number right here. So it has this class of achievement card number countries. Now we create a new counter and we said const countries counter equals a new counter. And as I said, for this config property right here, we will define an object with different key value pairs. So for the country element, we say const countries element equals, and then we have an object, and the first thing that we want is the selector. So selector, and that's what we just selected. And now we want to make sure that we can select it with document.querySelector. So we need to add the dot in front here so it knows this is a class name, and then we need to remove the space and also add a dot here so it knows that these are 2 different class names on one specific HTML element. Now we have this.selector variable inside of our counter object, and it's whatever our config object has as the selector property. And now we can pass in this countries element to our new counter instance. And you might have noticed I have a small typo right here, so it's not constructor but constructor, of course. Save this, and now in our project we can see that we have called this init console.log right here. Now the first thing that we want to do is we want to get a reference to the element right here. So to get started, we need an element property in our constructor function, and in the beginning it's null. And inside of our getElement function, we will set it to whatever is the selector that we have passed in. So it's this.element equals document.querySelector, and then we will pass in our this.selector. And to see that it's working, you can now say console.log this.element. And now we can see that it's this paragraph here with achievement cards, number, countries that we have selected. We have the element, so that's the first step. But what we actually want to do is we want to start out at 0 and then count up all the way to 23 in this case. So we need some sort of counting variable that we have up here, which is 0 at the beginning. And then we also want some sort of count end, which is some kind of number that we define in our config. We will also call it count end there. And now we add a count and property down here and we say 23. So now we can write a function that will start to count from 0 all the way to 23. So in our start counter function, we start by saying this.element.innerHTML equals whatever this.count is. So as you can see right now, it has changed from 23 to 0 because that's where we start with the count. And then we want to set a timeout and we call a callback function in here. And for now, let's just use 100 milliseconds as the interval. And we say if this.count, which is 0 at the start, is smaller than this.count end, then we want to count up, right? So we have to change this.count. And for now, let's just say plus equals 1. Now again, what this means is that when we call this start counter function, we will set the inner HTML to this.count, which is 0 at the beginning, and then we will call the setTimeout function with an interval of 100 milliseconds. So after 100 milliseconds, this code in here will run. So we see if this.count is smaller than this.count end. It is. This is 0, this is 23. And so we add 1. But what happens then? Well, we have a recursive function because we need to call this.startCounter again. And this whole loop will start until this if condition is not true anymore. So now you can see right here, it starts at 0 and then in steps of 1 it goes up all the way to 23. Because right here this.count is 1, we call this.startCounter again and it goes back into this loop. So we check again if this.count is smaller than this.count end. Right now count is 1. And count end is still 23, so it repeats it, count will be 2, and it calls this function again until this.count is this.count end, and this condition is no longer true. Now that works great in the countries property, but what if we have this customers element? We don't want to count up to 24,690 because that would take an insane amount of time. So we have to do something else. And what we will do is we will define 2 more properties in our config object that we can then replace here and here. So we want a this.step property, which is whatever is config.step. And then down here we will not say 1, but this.step. And then we add the step property down here and we set it to 1. Now we also want to be able to change the number of milliseconds. So we can do that down here. We say this.interval milliseconds, you can name this whatever you want, equals config.interval milliseconds. And again, we change the 100 milliseconds here to this.interval milliseconds. And now we need to add it to our countries element as well. We say interval milliseconds equals 100. And now it works just as it did before, but now we can also use it to use different steps in different milliseconds for the other 2 numbers. So to see how this works, let's copy this down here and once more. And this one we will call customers element, and down here we will call it years element. And with the selector, all we have to change is the end right here, so it's not countries but customers, and down here it's not countries but years. But of course nothing is happening yet because we need to create an instance of these 2 elements. So we will copy this as well, and instead of countries we say customers, and instead of countries down here we say years. And now as you can see, they're all the same. That's not what we want. So for the customers element, we did have a really large number. It was, I think, 24,690. Now what happens if we don't change the step or the interval? Well, it just starts to count up in 100 milliseconds interval and 1 increment at a time, so this will take really long. Now the way that we can change it is that we can say, well, we want steps of 50 and not 1, and we can change the interval milliseconds, let's say, to 1. Let's see how this looks. And now it counts up really fast. And the same with the years element, we want to end at 31 years. We can keep this at step 1. So now you can see that it counts very slowly on the right side. You could also make this interval shorter and then you make 100 milliseconds down here. And this would look like this. So as you can see, you now have a reusable counter class that you can initialize again and again to select different numbers inside of your HTML and then count up in different steps and intervals. If you did like this video, please leave a like and a comment down below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more videos like this in the future. As always, thanks for watching. See you next time.